So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the modifications that have gone into my 1982 Corvette, and we're going to talk specifically about the calibration file. But before I get to the calibration file, I'm just going to cover again some of the modifications I've made on the engine. So this 82 Corvette, it looks very stock in terms of the outside, and if you pop the hood on it, it probably looks like just about any other Crossfire injection car, except for the fact that it has an obvious aftermarket intake and the smog pump has been removed and replaced with an Aeromotive aftermarket fuel pressure regulator. So here are the mods on the car. It has two 90-pound truck injectors, one on each of the injector towers, and those 90-pound fuel injectors have 30 psi going to them. The car originally came with a 64 in the front and a 66 in the back tower, and was set at 13 psi, which delivered 130 pounds of fuel. But with two 90-pound injectors, each set at 30 psi, each one of those 90-pound injectors is now actually flowing 130 pounds of fuel. So I'm literally running twice as much fuel through the throttle bodies as factory was for the Corvette. And that's important because those throttle bodies are feeding a 496 thousandths of an inch lift cam with a set of AFR heads. I've got the Eliminator 180 heads on the car. I'm going to cover 5 things today: BPC, volumetric efficiency, spark advance, CTS Iat Bias, and closed loop settings, rich, lean, and mean, to talk about tuning modifications on an 82 Corvette with a 496-inch lift cam with AFR heads. So let's go ahead and let's get started. So I'm actually in my bin calibration file in Tuner Pro, and I'm going to pull up the particular table for BPC, which is base pulse constant. And what we're looking at here is BPC versus VAC. So let's go ahead and let's talk about this for a second. So BPC versus VAC. What this essentially is the computer's baseline understanding relative to pulse width and fuel pressure. So when you have a car that runs with a static fuel pressure, like the TBI cars usually did, you would see the same number regardless of the KPAs. So whether it was at 80 KPAs or greater in terms of demand on that engine, or as low as 20 KPAs and deceleration and things like that, it would be the same number. But with variable fuel pressure, what that allows someone to do is to run something like 25 psi, like I'm running at idle, and then you crack the throttle blades and it comes off of idle, and the fuel pressure jumps up to 30 psi. So what that allows the computer to do is to have some additional runway, so to speak, in terms of the VE table. Why is this important? Because when I was running static fuel pressure a long time ago with the combination I have, I ran out of VE at about 5,200 RPM. And so having that variable fuel pressure allowed me to get more injectors, so to speak, and more VE out of the injectors I have. So I'm running approximately 25 psi at idle. You crack the throttle blades, the psi jumps up, and so here you can see what that looks like in terms of the numbers. But let's look at it graphically, because I think that's important to show. So if I had static fuel pressure, it'd be like, say, 13 psi, and that's what I'm showing right here as the comparison, right? So this would be a typical General Motors TBI truck configuration, 13 psi and 65-pound injectors. You can see it's 135 all the way across. But in running variable code, I've got different fuel pressure here, and you can see how it changes. And it has somewhat of a linear, pretty close to linear progression across the KPA range. And so again, running that variable fuel pressure allows me to get a little more injector, so to speak, and be able to get the performance I'm looking for without exceeding my VE table. So BPC and VE and the fuel pressure are all very important to getting those baseline pieces right. Let's go ahead. We're going to move on. And I'm going to talk about VE. So let's go up into the table here for low speed and high speed VE. So let's look at this graphically. I'm going to move these tables around for just a minute here. And we're going to look at this here in terms of what the table looks like. So over on this end is 2000 RPM, okay, and let me move this over to the side just a little bit more and we'll shrink this up a little bit so folks can see it moving around. So this is what I essentially call like the wall, right? So this would be like wide open throttle, and I've got a little bit of a cushion in fuel here. And that's why you'll see those numbers here. But let's talk about how to orient folks to what this looks like. So pretty much this area right in around here would be idle. And then up in here would be the areas of deceleration, and this would be cruise pretty much right through here. And then we start getting up into here, and this is wide open throttle. So those are the portions of the table that kind of suit those needs. And then obviously once you get over 2000 RPM, this is like high speed deceleration, this is higher speed cruise, and then right over here, this is again, high speed wide open throttle. So we'll go back to that visual right here, and we'll just take a look at this. So what you'll notice here is that this is kind of like a bowl or a pocket, and this is really where my car idles, is in and around this area, from about 60 kPAs up to about 70, in and around this area. And that's largely driven by the cam that I have, the fact that I run at about 750 RPM to help smooth it out a little bit so it's not as choppy, and so I can maintain a good closed loop. So that's about where my car idles, is in around where you see this little pocket right here. So it kind of looks kind of like this if I pull it back up. Whoops, wrong one. So it's down in here. So let's say from 55 to 65. And that's up here. So let me go into this. Okay, so it's pretty much in around this area would be idle. So let me pull that back up. That little bowl right there, so to speak. So that would be kind of the idle range. Really where it idles for the most part when I actually see it bounce around is here and in this area. Right here, those three. That's actually where my idle really sits when I watch the data logs. But yeah, so that's idle, right? So then as it starts to come off idle and it comes over 1000 RPM, you know, that cam starts to open up from its idle. And then at about 2000 RPM, you start to see it, you know, starting to curve up here. And then on the high speed table, you'll see where it really comes to life. I'm going to go ahead and click off of the wide open throttle, but you see right here about 2000 RPM is where it really starts to build as it comes up. And the torque curve on this particular 496 inch left cam really starts to come to life, you know, at about 2600 RPM. And then it starts to crest, and by about 46 to 4800, the torque curve is pretty much done on that particular cam, but you can see what that looks like. So let's go ahead and let's compare what this cam profile looks like now that we've talked about where I'm creating peak torque, which always follows peak VE, and let's compare that to a stock cam. So for a stock cam, for say a TBI truck, a 350 TBI truck, it looks like this. You know, here's your idle right in around this area, and you see that same concept of a little bit of a bowl and right in this area for idle, and then you start to see it pick up, and you know that cam really starts to come to life at about 1400 RPM, and that's where the torque peak starts to pick up. And then if we look over into the high speed table, I'm going to flip this over to the factory cam, you can see that by about 2000 RPM, you know, we're achieving a peak VE at about 2800, and that's pretty much where the factory Crossfire produces peak torque in and around this 2800 to 3000 RPM range, and then after that it starts to taper off. And so you can see what that looks like. And by the time you get to about 3600, yeah, you can see how this just kind of nosedives as you get up to 4800. So if you watch this curve right here, this explains a lot of the behavior you'll see in Crossfire factory cars, is they have a lot of great torque and grunt down low up to about 2800 RPM. And then as they start to get past 3600, it pretty much dies off by the time it gets to 4800. And so a lot of the Crossfire cars, you know, you watch the red line on the tach and you watch the performance on them. Most of them shift out, some out of first gear, for example, somewhere between 4800 and 5000 RPM. And so, like I said, if you watch this nosedive right here from about 3600, that's pretty consistent with the Crossfire running out of steam. But with my particular combination with the 496-inch left cam, along with the AFR heads and that 2-inch throttle body and everything else that I have on that engine, you can really start to see where that cam starts to come to life and how it flows through. So again, like I said, for my car, I'm starting to pick up at about 2400, and then I'm pretty much done with my torque curve at about 4800, right here and around this area, 46 to 4800, and then I'm just basically riding the power that it creates, which is fairly flat towards the end. Okay, so let's talk about this. Nope, not going to save any of those. Nope, we're not going to save any of that. So let's go in and let's talk about SA, Spark Advance. So we're going to come in here and I'm going to pick up the SA table. We'll start with the main table. That's probably the best one to look at. So here's what my Spark table looks like. Again, to orient folks, 50 to about 75 kPAs is in around idle. Over here, 95 and 100 is wide open throttle, 30 and 40 is deceleration, and then somewhere between 50 and 80 from about 1,000 RPM up to about 5,200 RPM would essentially be cruise. So again, cruise, deceleration, idle, wide open throttle. So that's kind of what the table looks like. This table that I use is actually based on a 1985-1986 Ironhead Corvette table, and it seems to translate very nicely with a little bit of smoothing to be used on a set of AFR heads. So you can see here the maximum spark I have at wide open throttle on the base table is 31.99 degrees, which is about 32 degrees, and then I add in about another 2.5 degrees to bring me up to a total of almost 35 degrees of overall advance when I'm in primary enrichment mode or wide open throttle. So we'll flip this over and we'll just kind of compare this to a TBI truck. So very different. The first thing that you notice is all these ridges and bumps and valleys and things like that. And a lot of this is just kind of a function of what GM engineers had to come up with in order for the cars to slide through emissions regulations and whatnot. So sometimes these correspond with torque bands and gears and weight of the car and things like that. So they're a little bit choppy looking. They don't necessarily need to be. A good tuner will go in and smooth things up, and a table will start to look somewhat similar to something like this, which would be my table. All right, next up, we're going to talk about CTS and Iat bias. Let's go into here. There we go. There's the blend filter. That's what I'm looking for. So what this does essentially, if you use EBL, you have an opportunity to use an intake air temperature sensor. And basically that sits in the stream of ambient air that's going to go into the throttle bodies. It's not like the old days of TPI where you had a sensor that was jammed up inside of the plenum. This is something that sits in the tubing and the ducting ahead of the actual throttle body and the plenum itself. So I'm running a IAT. My IAT actually sits on my 82 just in front of the radiator in the airstream that comes up from the front spoiler and before the air goes into the fresh air chamber. So as the car rides down the road, it gets that almost like a mini ram air effect as it comes into the fresh air chamber. And that's important because I'm going to talk about the differences here between stock and my modified settings. So on a GM truck, which is fairly restricted in terms of its air filter and snorkeling system and whatnot, you would probably see that it would start out at, and these GM seconds, these are grams a second of basically airflow. So obviously very little airflow, a lot of airflow by the time you get to the bottom. And so what you're looking at here is essentially a fairly linear curve that really relates to how the engine is going to pull air in on a GM truck. Whereas on my particular system, the faster I start to go, and so I'm pulling in about 16 grams a second, pretty much at like a low speed cruise. But then when I start to stomp on the accelerator and that engine starts to pick up, I'll usually hit over 200 grams a second on wide open throttle, almost 224 when I'm hitting peak torque. And so what happens is as the car starts to go faster, the air starts to cool. And as the air starts to cool, because it doesn't have as much time to get warm going through the snorkeling and the ducting, it stays denser. So what I start to do is I start to point less towards the CTS and more towards the air intake temperature sensor. And that allows me to really use that dense, cold, fresh air in and get a really good measurement on exactly how thick it is for a good air-fuel ratio and ultimately a good VE table. And so if you have an 82 Corvette and you're using the fresh air chamber, go ahead and take the flap out. You don't need it. And then start to look at how to set your bias using your wideband oxygen sensor and your grams a second to give you an idea of, do I need to either increase the bias towards the IAT or do I need to increase it towards the CTS? But as you can see, a truck compared to a Corvette with that great air intake plumbing right there in the fresh air chamber, you can see what a benefit that fresh air chamber is, because it really drives in a lot of cold, dense air. Compared to trying to breathe through a fender or something like that, or worse yet, breathe warm air from underneath the hood. So again, getting your CTS IAT blend filter is really important for getting your overall mixture, especially when you're running in open loop, because you don't have the benefit of the oxygen sensor anymore telling the computer to do trim. When you go into primary enrichment mode and wide open throttle, it's going to freeze the integrator, and when that happens, it's basically just going to go on last known good bias for the integrator, and then go off of other calculations to include things like the IAT CTS blend filter. All right, so the last thing I'm going to cover is integrator. So the integrator essentially is, okay, we'll grab this one. We'll go right here for rich O2 upper and lean O2 lower. So I'm going to put this down here, and this is going to be kind of an interesting way to show things, but because usually the larger numbers are on the top. But for argument's sake, we'll just say that lower numbers, a more rich car, right? Lower AFR would be consistent with higher millivolt readings. A leaner car is going to have lower millivolt readings, and so that's why you see the lean as lower, right? Is this table is sitting up here, and I've got the rich upper down here. It's kind of opposite of what you would think of things, but for discussion's sake, just trust me on this. So if you're shooting for 14.7 air-fuel ratio, you're going to have a point where if you go down the millivolts, it's going to be leaner. If you go up in the millivolts, it's going to be richer. So this is essentially a lower air-fuel ratio, right? Or a greater fuel, less air. And this up here is the exact opposite. So this is running leaner and this is running richer. Now, what I did is I used my wideband oxygen sensor to walk in these values right here. Well, what does 14.7 for my car look like? Well, it looks like about 642 millivolts. What does about 14 flat look like? 13.8 to 14 flat. About 672. What does 15 to 15.2 look like? About 16.28. So I used my wideband oxygen sensor to help me walk in the values on the narrow band, and that's what you're looking at. Now, if you look at a truck calibration, you'll notice the values change based on the KPAs, and they're also consistently lower. And here's the reason why. On a truck, this is partly a result of the design of the exhaust system. On most of the GM TBI trucks, they'd start out, with a left and right bank, and it'd come together in a Y pipe, and then go through the catalytic converter, and then out the back on one side. And so, so the design of that particular exhaust system would contribute to the overall temperature, given the amount of gas that was inside of the exhaust pipes. So I'm running true duals with aftermarket hooker headers and an H pipe. And so for my particular car, I've walked in what 14.7 would look like, not to be, somewhere around 477 at idle, but to actually be closer to 642 at idle. And then looking up here off of idle, when I drive around town, I'm maybe in around like, you know, the 60, 70 kPAs or something, and it's about, you know, 451 for the truck and 477. Mine's really closer to, again, 16.6. Meanwhile, on the rich side of things, you know, the trucks would have it at about, you know, 520 or 507 for a high 13s, low 14s air fuel ratio. And, you know, what I experienced was closer to like a 672. So I actually used my wideband oxygen sensor to walk these three values in so I could get the air fuel ratio I wanted. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to show you, so this is kind of a bonus. I know I said I was going to talk about 5, but I'm going to go into 6. So what I'm looking for here, I'm going to share this with y'all, is the open loop. So here's the open loop table right here, and you can see right around 60 kPAs, 50 kPAs. I'm about 14, you know, for open loop. And then, you know, when you start getting up into some of these ranges right here, which, you know, this is versus VAC versus RPM. So you got to understand this is going to be like deceleration. And then over here is going to be wide open throttle. So I'm usually running in the deceleration range about 14.7. And then in the wide open throttle range, it's usually around like, you know, 12.2, 12.4 to 1. And so this is kind of my base table before I go into closed loop. And then the computer will basically use this as its starting point and then use the rich, lean, and mean values to help try to trim it to get it to these numbers, whether it be at idle, wide open throttle, cruise, and what have you. Now again, just as a reminder, once the car goes into primary enrichment mode or wide open throttle, it's going to lock the integrator and the BLM. And so, you know, what you'll see here is essentially what it's going to take as being kind of the baseline that, you know, we had gotten it to be able to manage to this level, and then we're just going to, you know, trim from there because the oxygen sensor isn't actually used during wide open throttle. So if you get these numbers right and you get them where you want them, and you've used your wideband oxygen sensor to walk the values in for your rich, lean, and mean, you should be able to get the AFRs that you're looking for, and you'll confirm those using a wideband oxygen sensor. Now, the last thing I'll just say is that probably one of the best features of EBL really is going to be its ability to create a VE table for you using the VE learn function. Now, if you use the wideband, it'll get you started. Then use the wideband to walk your AFR values in, as well as your rich, lean, and mean values for your oxygen sensor. And then, you know, you switch over from the wideband oxygen sensor to letting the narrowband actually trim the table, and you'll end up with a really nice looking table right here like I have. And won't have a whole lot of choppy pieces and parts, and it should transition nicely through what you're looking for it to do.